Learning color theory means learning the language of color. And there are some somewhat universal terms related to color. I say somewhat universal because there's some terms that are used interchangeably, some terms that are used for certain types of color mixing. So maybe the mixing of the color of light rather than the mixing of the color of paint. I'm really talking about the mixing of colors of paint, specifically acrylic, but you can use this language and the principles in watercolor, really any physical media. So let's start with a couple terms that really help us understand or give us a good basis as we start to learn about the language of color. So let's talk about the word color. So what is color? I mean, on one hand, a color is a color. We know what it is. We learned about them when we were kids, but really it's a combination of a pigment. It's the lighting. It's what color it's next to. It's also our perception. So all those things come together to make a color, but that also adds to the complexity of color and maybe the interesting part of learning about color. Now let's talk about the word relative. And this is really important because I'll say quite a bit, a color is relative, or this aspect of color is relative. So our perception of color really depends on what the color is next to or being compared against. It's also heavily influenced by lighting and surrounding colors. Now let's look at these gray colors. So you take a mid-gray color, put it next to a dark color, and that mid-gray will seem lighter. Now put the same gray next to a light color, and it'll seem darker. And I promise you, these two middle grays are exactly the same. And as you learn about color, you'll find many aspects of color are relative. Now there's three big terms that really help you understand color. And those are hue, chroma, and value. They're very common terms and they help artists define a specific color. Let's start with hue. So hue means color family. Red is a hue, blue is another hue, yellow is a hue, orange is a hue. Let's use red as an example here. Quite a few different colors are red. Think of quinacridone magenta, cadmium red, permanent rose. They're all pretty different, but they're all considered red because they're part of the red family of colors. Now let's talk about chroma. Chroma is the intensity or purity of a color. And a pure color is when it's most highly chromatic. Keep in mind that a pure color isn't necessarily high chroma. A lemon yellow straight out of the tube is high chroma, but a yellow ochre, it's not high chroma. It doesn't have the intensity that a lemon yellow has. Now you can take a color straight out of the tube, and if you want to make it less highly chromatic, you can add a complementary color or a gray. And here I've added purple, the complementary to yellow, to the lemon yellow, and I've added gray as well. Some people use the term saturation instead of chroma. Saturation really is more to do with the mixing of light, so you might see it if you're using Photoshop or something like that. You might see the term saturation instead of chroma. But when it comes to mixing paint, chroma is the more correct term. I do tend to use them interchangeably because I came from a television broadcasting background where I used to have to mix light. Let's talk about value, which is the lightness or darkness of a color. The value of a color is often compared using a value scale, which usually has 9 or 10 steps from black to white. And you can also think about taking a photo with your phone and turning it to black and white, and you'll clearly see the value of different colors. Some pure colors naturally have a light value, such as yellow, while purple is generally really dark, and you can adjust a color's value by mixing with other colors or black or white paint. Now let's add a couple more terms that will help you define a color with greater precision. And these two terms, sometimes they're used interchangeably, sometimes not. For example, a warm yellow can be called a red yellow, and vice versa. So temperature, so that's whether a color is warm or cool. And generally speaking, red, blue, and purple are considered cool colors, while red, orange, and yellow are warm. When painting, you'll often want to use cool colors and shadows and warm colors for where the light is hitting the object or scene. Color temperature is relative, so take blue as an example. Blue is generally considered a cool color, but when ultramarine blue and cerulean blue are next to each other, ultramarine blue is warm, while cerulean is cool. Now put purple next to the ultramarine blue. The purple is now the warm color, since it's closer to red, while the ultramarine blue is now considered the cool color. Now, very similarly, bias, and that's the direction a color leans on the color wheel. So take a yellow paint. Since yellow is in between red and green on the color wheel, yellow can be green biased or red biased. A lemon yellow is a green yellow because it's closer to green on the color wheel and it inherently has some green to it. It can also be called cool. And a cadmium yellow deep is a red yellow since it's closer to red on the color wheel. and that could be your warm yellow. If you want to master color mixing, you'll need to understand color bias. When you can identify the color bias, it will ensure you can mix the color you actually want. So if you want a vibrant green, use a yellow with a green bias or green yellow, such as lemon yellow, and a blue with a green bias, or a green blue, such as phthalo blue. Now let's quickly talk about types of colors. So there's primary colors. So just like when you were a kid, primary colors are red, blue, and yellow. Remember, it can be any red, any blue, any yellow, gives you different results. But these are the 3 primary colors that can be used to mix any hue. Now, secondary colors are the colors you can mix with 2 primaries. So unlike when you were kids, now that you're learning color theory, you'll learn that mixing colors is a little bit more complicated. So while you can use red and yellow to create an orange, you can't create any orange. It depends on your red and yellow. Now, tertiary colors, that's when you mix a primary and a secondary. We get a tertiary color. Turquoise is a tertiary because it's a mix of green and blue. Now, one more term, complementary colors. Those are 2 colors opposite on a color wheel. When you mix 2 complementary colors, you get black. Complementary colors also tend to have a high contrast or vibrancy when next to each other. So there's a few words that will help you understand the language of color theory. And this is just the beginning. There's tons to learn about color theory, acrylic paint color mixing, and if you want to learn more, subscribe to my channel.